Well, good morning, everyone. As Andrew kindly pointed out, a few years ago, I used to run another think tank called Policy Exchange. And I was infamous at Policy Exchange for never reading any of Policy Exchange's reports. So therefore, I found myself quite surprised to be actually reading this report yesterday to the end. And that is because it is both very readable, but actually chock full of interesting, illuminating, and frankly pretty terrifying numbers and insights. So I do heartily recommend it. In particular, I applaud the suggested further indicators that the government should be using to check whether it is getting absolute best value for money from all of the money that goes through it. In page 5 of the report, you'll see that they list the existing indicators, but then suggest 5 further ones: saving cash lost through fraud, managing cash more effectively, targeting net liabilities, productivity, and localism. And I think particularly the first 4 are ones where these would be very useful measures. I had my own painful experience of learning the importance of cash management the hard way. Before Policy Exchange, in a sort of rather pathetic attempt to emulate Michael Heseltine's career, I ran a business. I set up a business in the deluded hope that I could make myself financially independent before going into politics. And Michael Heseltine succeeded, and I failed, in part because I suspect he understood about cash management and I didn't. So my little business that manufactured decorating tools was growing like topsy, was extremely profitable, and I just couldn't understand at the age of 28 why there didn't ever seem to be any cash at the end of the year. And it was simply that I wasn't very interested in our debtor book, and I wasn't very interested in our creditor book, and the two of them were in a position where the cash just went into working capital, and I never got any of it. So though it is boring, and David's right about that, it is deathly boring, it is vitally important. And I hope that the Prime Minister never puts me in charge of it, but I hope that he puts somebody in charge of it who will do a better job than I did in an earlier life. The aspect of the report that I'd like to focus on is the discussion of productivity. I don't know if any of you listened to the Prime Minister's Queen's Speech response yesterday, but he ended by making the argument, which I think is an extremely important argument, which is that actually the one thing that links together almost everything that this government is doing is the search for future competitiveness for the British economy. Because that fundamentally is the big threat. The debt and the deficit, they're a threat, but solving them doesn't solve the big long-term threat. That comes from the fact that we are in a much more competitive world. There are people with much higher productivity than us elsewhere in the world who work longer, who are paid less, who have less sick pay, who don't have any maternity leave, let alone flexible maternity-paternity leave, and do not have 28 days holiday a year and about 10 bank holidays with one extra added every time the Queen has a birthday. And if we are going to have those public services that we want, and those pensions that we want, and the social care that we want, and the health service that we want, then we are going to have to find a way to retain and maintain and continuously improve our competitiveness in this country. And ultimately, competitiveness rests on productivity, labour productivity. And there is a worrying picture. The first part of that worrying picture is that we start behind, not just behind some of our new competitors, but behind countries that we would normally compare ourselves with. I don't have the exact figures in my head, but we are between 16 and 20% behind France, Germany, and the United States in productivity per hour worked in the UK. So we are already at a disadvantage. Equally worrying, we are coming out of this recession, and the report highlights this with an excellent chart, I think on page 23 or something. Yes, page 23. We're coming out of the latest recession with productivity growing much more slowly than it did as we came out of previous recessions. So we do not seem to be making up that lost ground as quickly as we should. And the report rightly focuses on the contribution of public sector productivity to that overall picture. Because while productivity in the tradable sector, as economists would call it, those goods and services that are traded internationally and therefore competed with other international suppliers, is the most important in determining our long-term future, ultimately the economy will not be prosperous, people will not have rising living standards if that vast number of people and that vast amount of money that goes through the public sector is not itself subject to significant improvements in productivity. And on a later page, there is a chart, page 24, which shows productivity decline since 1997 in the public services of 0.3% a year. And that, for me, is one of the most worrying things about the current state of the state. But it is an opportunity, because if there has been no productivity improvement in all of that time, then there is a huge opportunity for productivity improvement. There should be some relatively easy wins in productivity available within the public sector. And that is, the search for those productivity improvements is the key driver behind the government's Open Services White Paper and the really important elements within that: transparency about data, competition between suppliers, choice for consumers, and, as David has talked about, payment by results. Now, these are not new concepts, many of them. Tony Blair tried them out and began to blaze the trail for some of these reforms. But we have to admit that for all they have been terrifically controversial politically and with public sector unions, they've hardly touched the public sector yet. They've touched, interestingly, local government much more. Local government is far ahead of central government in most of these reforms. But in the great central bureaucracies, whether in health or criminal justice or welfare, we've got a huge way to go. Now, they do throw up some very thorny questions, and I'd like to leave you with three that worry me and that I hope may occupy Reform and Deloitte in the months to come. How can payment by results work in a world where we're all told that integrated care is the answer to better healthcare at a lower cost? How do you pay someone for a result when the result is them not going to hospital and not having a hip replacement or some intervention to cure their diabetes? How do you pay for the result of health maintenance? It's a huge question to which I have not yet heard a convincing answer. I hope that Reform and Deloitte will provide one. How do you ensure, and the report does go into this, and I have very, very direct local experience of this in my constituency, how do you ensure efficient, low-cost but high-quality provision of social services in a fragmented world of personal budgets? Now, in my constituency, we have some daycare centres that many people rely on to take in their relatives who have learning disabilities or other conditions, to give them, frankly, a day to go and do the shopping, or a day to go to work, or a day to just have a bit of a break and clean the house. Now, those daycare centres are being closed by Lincolnshire County Council eventually, and the reason why is because Lincolnshire County Council is no longer going to get the block grant at the top. The money is all going to the customers. But the customers won't all want to go to the same daycare centres. And now that is an empowering reform that should drive up productivity, that should produce diversity, that should produce greater choice. But will that provision that comes forward be as efficient and as high quality at a low cost as the provision that it is replacing? It is not obvious that it will, or immediate. And then my final question, which I think will occur in all areas of the public sector where we go through these reforms, is how do you deal with failure? Because in the private sector, frankly, it's pretty simple. People fail. Companies go bust. Companies are taken over by their competitors. Employees may lose their jobs and get rehired. And yes, we know we can all feel sorry when Clinton Cards goes into receivership, but there isn't going to be a public strike. There isn't going to be some desperate case of human suffering as a result of the closure of one business. That is not true if it's a school. That is not true if it is a hospital. That is not true if it is a care home. That is not true if it is a probation trust. That is not true if it is a prison. Failure has to somehow be intercepted at an earlier stage by the state and managed. But how is that going to happen? When, as will inevitably happen, academy chains, some of them, start going wrong, badly wrong, what's going to happen? Who's going to do it? These are all enormous questions, questions posed to this government and future governments, because they will not be solved in the next 20 years. But the fact remains that this is a direction that the country has to go on if we are to have any chance to have high-quality services that we can afford as our population ages and the world becomes more competitive. And I look forward to your help in working out how we solve that particular conundrum. Thank you.